The year was 1893, and the Colorado winter had sunk its teeth deep into the land, freezing the very soul of the earth. For Emily, the cold was more than just a physical sensation. It was a reflection of the vast, frozen emptiness that had taken root inside her. Her parents, stolen by a swift and merciless fever, were gone. The relatives who had taken her in had quickly cast her out, their greed for her family's small plot of land far outweighing any sense of familial duty. Now, she had nothing. No money, no home, no reason to draw another breath. So she came to the river. The water, black and slick under the sliver of a pale moon, churned with ice floes that scraped against the banks like whispers of death. The air was so cold it burned her lungs with each shallow gasp. This was it, a quiet end to a life that had become too loud with pain. She took a step into the numbing current, then another, the icy water seeping through her worn boots and thin dress, a final, brutal baptism. She closed her eyes, ready for the river to claim her, to pull her under and silence the storm in her heart. But before the current could take its prize, a strength that was not the river's wrapped around her waist. It was firm, unyielding, and achingly warm against the encroaching frost. A startled gasp escaped her lips, a puff of white in the frigid air. She turned, her movements clumsy in the thigh-deep water, and her eyes met his. He was a man carved from the rugged land itself. His face was a tapestry of sharp angles and weathered lines. His skin, the color of rich earth kissed by the sun. High cheekbones and a strong jaw spoke of the native blood that ran in his veins. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were dark, deep-set, and filled with a sorrow so profound it seemed to mirror her own. It was Jace Walker, a man she'd only heard of in town, the quiet half-native rancher who kept to himself, the Native American cowboy. He didn't speak. He didn't try to drag her back to the shore. He simply stood there with her, a silent anchor in the freezing, relentless water, his arms a bastion against the river's pull. The sheer unexpectedness of his presence, his silent solidarity, shattered the last of her resolve. "I'm not worth saving," she whispered, the words brittle and broken, swallowed almost immediately by the wind. Tears she didn't know she had left to cry began to freeze on her cheeks. His voice, when it finally came, was a low rumble, thick with an emotion that shook him to his core. "Maybe not to them," he said, his gaze fixed on her, unwavering. "But to me, you're the first soul I've seen who knows my kind of pain." The words struck her with more force than the river's current. He saw her not as a burden or a charity case, but as a kindred spirit in suffering. His arms were still around her, a steadying presence as the world tilted on its axis. "Why are you still holding me?" she trembled, the cold and the raw emotion making her entire body quake. He murmured his reply, his voice so close to her ear it was a breath of warmth in the icy night. He tightened his grip, pulling her infinitesimally closer. "Because if you go," he said, his voice cracking on the last word, "then I go, too." And that was it. The dam broke. A sob tore from her throat, raw and agonizing, and she collapsed against his chest, weeping for her parents, for her lost home, for the utter soul-crushing loneliness that had driven her into the river. He just held her, absorbing her grief, his own silent tears mingling with the cold night air. When her sobs finally subsided into ragged breaths, he moved, with a strength that seemed almost impossible. He lifted her from the water as if she weighed nothing. He carried her to the frozen shore, setting her down gently before shrugging off his heavy sheepskin coat and wrapping it around her shivering frame. The coat smelled of leather, pine, and wood smoke, the scent of life. "Die another day if you must," he said softly, his voice still thick with unshed sorrow. "But tonight, live with me." He didn't wait for an answer. He helped her onto his horse, a sturdy mare that stood patiently, its breath pluming in the dark. He mounted behind her, his body a shield against the biting wind, and urged the horse forward, away from the river of sorrows, and into the heart of the desolate, beautiful night. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Emily didn't feel alone. She leaned back against the solid warmth of the Native American cowboy who had walked into the river with her, and let the rhythmic clopping of the horse's hooves carry her toward an unknown dawn. The journey to his ranch was a blur of muted colors and silent understanding. Jace's property was tucked away in a small, sheltered valley, miles from the prying eyes of the town. A simple, sturdy log cabin stood against the backdrop of snow-dusted pines, a thin curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney, a beacon of warmth in the vast, cold wilderness. A few horses stood quietly in a corral, their dark shapes unmoving in the moonlight. Inside, a fire was already crackling in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. The cabin was sparse but immaculately clean. It was a man's home, built for function, not comfort. Yet it felt more welcoming than any place Emily had been in months. There was a small kitchen area, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a bed in the corner, covered with thick wool blankets. Jace sat her down in a chair near the fire, the sheepskin coat still wrapped around her. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, fetching a blanket and draping it over her shoulders. He disappeared for a moment and returned with a steaming mug of what smelled like herbal tea. He pressed it into her trembling hands. "Drink," he commanded gently. "It will warm you from the inside." She did as she was told, the hot liquid chasing away some of the deep bone-chilling cold. They sat in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. It wasn't an awkward silence, it was a shared space of quiet contemplation, a silent acknowledgement of the abyss they had both stood at the edge of. Emily watched him as he tended to the fire. He was a man of contrasts. The hard lines of his face and the calloused strength in his hands spoke of a difficult life, the demanding work of a rancher, a cowboy. Yet, his movements were gentle, his eyes held a deep well of compassion, and his connection to the world seemed rooted in something older, something tied to the earth itself, the heritage of his native ancestors. He was a bridge between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, a solitary figure against a harsh landscape. Finally, her voice, though still shaky, found its strength. "You knew," she stated, not a question but a realization. "When you found me, you knew what I was going to do." Jace stopped stoking the fire and looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the flames. "The river calls to the broken," he said, his voice low and somber. "I've heard its song before." The simple, honest confession hung in the air between them, a fragile thread of shared experience. He didn't pity her, he understood. That understanding was a greater gift than any rescue. He saw the wounds she carried because he was carrying his own. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate for the life he had handed back to her. He simply nodded, accepting her gratitude without fanfare. He stood and went to a cupboard, taking out a loaf of bread and a wedge of cheese. He sliced them with a worn hunting knife and placed them on a plate, setting it on the small table. It was a simple meal, but to Emily, who hadn't eaten a proper meal in days, it was a feast. As she ate, he told her she could take the bed. He would sleep in the chair by the fire. She tried to protest, but he was insistent, his quiet authority leaving no room for argument. When she was finally settled under the heavy warmth of the blankets cocooned in the scent of pine and smoke, she watched him as he sat down, his silhouette a stoic, lonely shape against the flickering firelight. Sleep did not come easily. The events of the night replayed in her mind, the icy water, the despair, and then the sudden anchoring presence of the man across the room, the Native American cowboy who had not just saved her from the river but had saved her from herself, not by pulling her out but by stepping in. As she finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, a single, unfamiliar feeling settled in her heart, a tiny, fragile seed planted in the frozen wasteland of her grief. Hope. Dawn broke across the valley, painting the snow-covered landscape in soft hues of pink and gold. The world outside the cabin window looked pristine, beautiful, and utterly indifferent to the turmoil of human hearts. Emily awoke slowly, the warmth of the blankets a stark contrast to the icy chill she had felt in the river. For a moment she was disoriented, the unfamiliar scent of wood smoke and old leather filling her senses. Then, the memory of the previous night rushed back, and she sat up, her heart pounding. The cabin was quiet. The fire in the hearth had been reduced to glowing embers, but the room was still warm. Jace was gone. A pang of fear, sharp and cold, shot through her. Had he left her? Had it all been a dream born of desperation? She swung her legs out of bed, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. His coat, which she had been wearing, lay folded neatly at the foot of the bed. Her own dress, now dry, was hanging on a peg by the fire. She quickly dressed and looked around the small cabin. On the table sat a bowl of water for washing and a clean worn piece of cloth. It was another small, thoughtful gesture that spoke volumes. As she cautiously opened the cabin door, the crisp morning air hit her face. The scene that greeted her was one of serene, hard-working solitude. Jace was in the corral, moving among his horses with a calm, confident grace. He spoke to them in a low, murmuring tone, a language of soft clicks and gentle reassurances. He wasn't breaking them. He was communicating with them. It was a partnership, a dance of mutual respect between man and beast. He moved like he belonged to this land, a part of its ancient rhythm. This was the life of the Native American cowboy, a life that blended the traditions of the open range with a deeper, inherited understanding of the natural world. He hadn't just built a ranch on this land. He was a steward of it. He must have sensed her presence, for he turned his head and looked at her. His expression was unreadable, his face impassive in the morning light, but his eyes held a flicker of something, a question. He finished brushing down a beautiful paint horse and then walked toward the cabin, his steps sure and steady on the packed snow. "Good morning," he said, his voice a quiet rumble. "There's coffee on the stove." "Thank you," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. For everything." He nodded, accepting her thanks as he had the night before. "You were tired. I let you sleep." They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, the vast, quiet landscape stretching out around them. Emily felt a strange sense of peace, a feeling that had been alien to her for so long. Here, away from the judging eyes of the town and the painful memories of her past, the world felt simpler, more honest. I don't have anywhere to go," she confessed, the words tasting of shame. "I can work, I can cook, clean. I won't be a burden." Jace looked at her, his gaze searching. He wasn't looking at what she could offer. He seemed to be looking into her very soul, gauging the strength of the fragile hope he had witnessed being born the night before. "Stay," he said simply. "There is no debt here. You stay as long as you need." And so, she stayed. The days that followed were quiet and rhythmic, governed by the rising and setting of the sun and the needs of the ranch. Emily took over the household chores, turning the sparse cabin into a home. She cooked meals, cleaned and mended Jace's worn clothes, finding a strange solace in the simple, repetitive tasks. It was work that mattered, work that sustained life. Jace in turn went about his daily routines, tending to his horses and the small herd of cattle he kept. He rarely spoke unless necessary, but his actions were a language all their own. He would leave a small, brightly colored feather he'd found on the table for her, or point out the tracks of a snowshoe hare near the cabin. They were small gestures, bridges across the chasm of their individual griefs. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the cabin filled with the comforting smell of the rabbit stew she had made, the silence between them felt different. It was heavier, freighted with the unspoken stories of their pasts. Emily knew that if this fragile trust between them was to grow, she had to be the one to speak first. She had to show him the scars she carried. "My parents were good people," she began, her voice soft but clear. "They loved this land. My father built our home with his own 2 hands. When the fever took them, it happened so fast. One week they were healthy, the next gone." She paused, staring into the flames, the firelight glinting off the unshed tears in her eyes. "My uncle, my father's brother, he said he would take care of me, but he only wanted the farm. He made me sign papers I didn't understand. A week later he told me I was no longer welcome. He said I was a drain on his resources." The clinical cruelty of the word still had the power to wound her. She wrapped her arms around herself, a subconscious gesture of self-protection. Jace listened without interrupting, his entire being focused on her. He didn't offer empty platitudes or words of pity. He simply gave her the gift of his undivided attention, letting her know she was heard. When she finished, the silence returned, but now it was filled with her story. After a long moment, Jace finally spoke, his own voice heavy with the weight of memory. "My wife was named Tala, which means stalking wolf in the tongue of my mother's people," he began, and the use of the past tense sent a fresh wave of sorrow through the room. "She was like a wildflower, strong, beautiful, and utterly untamable. We had a son. We called him Tiani, Little Wolf." He looked away from the fire, his gaze turned inward, to a place of profound pain. "The winter 5 years ago was hard. A sickness came to the valley, the same one that visits the town. It took our son first. He was so small, a muscle clenched in his jaw. I rode to town for the doctor. I begged him, but he wouldn't come. He said he didn't treat our kind." The words were spoken without anger, but with a deep, hollow resignation that was far more heartbreaking. "Tala followed our son a week later. She died in my arms, right here, in this cabin." She said the world was too quiet without his laughter. He fell silent, the story of his own immense loss hanging in the small cabin, intertwining with hers. Now, Emily understood the sorrow carved in his eyes. It wasn't just grief, it was the pain of injustice, of being an outcast in the land of his birth. He was a Native American cowboy, a man who walked in the white man's world but was never truly a part of it, and who carried the heritage of a people who had lost so much. "I'm so sorry, Jace," she whispered, her own grief momentarily eclipsed by the sheer magnitude of his. He turned his gaze back to her, and for the first time she saw beyond the pain. She saw a flicker of the man he must have been before, a husband, a father. "We all carry scars, Emily," he said, his voice raspy with emotion. "Some on the outside, some on the inside. It doesn't mean we are broken, it just means we have survived." That night, something shifted between them. They were no longer just 2 strangers bound by a shared moment of despair. They were 2 survivors, 2 souls who had bared their deepest wounds to one another and found not judgment, but understanding. In the quiet solitude of the Colorado wilderness, under the silent watch of the stars, a fragile, tentative healing had begun. They had shown each other their scars, and in doing so had taken the first step toward letting them heal. As winter slowly began to loosen its grip on the valley, a similar thaw started to occur within the walls of the small cabin. The stark silence that had once defined their days was gradually replaced by a comfortable quiet, punctuated by moments of shared work, soft-spoken words, and even the rare fleeting ghost of a smile. The deep, raw wounds of their pasts remained, but the constant, throbbing pain had begun to recede, leaving behind a dull ache of memory rather than an all-consuming agony. Emily found a purpose in the rhythm of the ranch. She learned the names of Jace's horses, each one treated more like a partner than a possession. There was Dust Devil, the fiery paint stallion; Willow, the gentle mare who had carried her from the river; and a young, curious colt they simply called Shadow. Jace taught her how to approach them, not with dominance, but with a quiet respect that he explained was central to the ways of his mother as people. "They understand your heart better than your words," he told her one crisp morning as he showed her how to brush Willow's coat. "Horses like the land, they know if you are a friend or a threat. It is the way of the native cowboy, we listen more than we command." His hands were gentle but sure as he guided hers, his touch sending a small, unexpected shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. She focused on the task, her strokes becoming more confident as the mare leaned into her touch with a soft nicker. In that simple, peaceful moment, Emily felt a connection not just to the animal but to the world around her, a world she had been so ready to leave. Jace, in turn, began to change. The stoic, impenetrable mask he wore so often began to crack. He would watch her as she worked, a strange, unreadable expression in his dark eyes. He started sharing more of himself, not in long speeches, but in small, meaningful ways. He taught her to identify bird calls, to read the weather in the clouds, and to find the first signs of spring, the tiny green shoots pushing their way through the melting snow. He showed her the worn leather pouch he carried, filled with dried herbs and stones passed down from his grandmother, a medicine woman. He explained that his heritage wasn't just in his blood, but in his worldview. For him, the land was not something to be conquered and tamed, as it was for so many of the settlers. It was a living, breathing entity to be respected. This deep, spiritual connection to his roots was an integral part of his identity as a Native American cowboy, a quiet rebellion against a world that sought to erase that part of him. One afternoon, a late spring snowstorm blew in unexpectedly, blanketing the valley in a fresh layer of white and trapping them inside the cabin. The wind howled outside, a lonely, mournful sound, but inside, the fire crackled warmly, and the small space felt like a sanctuary against the storm. Emily was mending one of Jace's shirts when she pricked her finger with the needle. A small drop of blood welled up, and she instinctively put it to her lips with a soft hiss of pain. Jace, who had been oiling a saddle by the fire, was at her side in an instant. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice laced with a concern that was surprisingly fierce. "It's nothing," she said, flustered by his sudden proximity. "Just a clumsy mistake." He gently took her hand, his calloused thumb brushing against her skin as he inspected the tiny wound. His touch was electric, a current of warmth that spread up her arm and settled deep in her chest. The air in the cabin suddenly felt thick, charged with an unspoken tension. They were so close she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, could feel the warmth of his breath on her cheek. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between them. It was a moment suspended in time, filled with all the things they hadn't said, all the feelings that had been slowly, quietly growing in the space between them. He finally released her hand, the spell broken, and stepped back. "Be careful," he murmured, his voice rougher than usual, before turning back to his work. The storm passed, but the storm inside the cabin lingered. Something had shifted. The comfortable companionship they had built was now tinged with a new, fragile awareness. They moved around each other with a heightened sense of caution, a shyness that hadn't existed before. The unspoken had become a palpable presence. A few days later, Emily was gathering firewood when she saw him by the small, makeshift grave markers he had erected on a hill overlooking the valley. Two simple wooden crosses, weathered by the elements. He was standing perfectly still, his back to her, a solitary figure etched against the vast, blue sky. Her heart ached for him, for the unbearable weight of the grief he carried so silently. She didn't want to intrude, but her feet seemed to move of their own accord, carrying her up the small hill. She stopped a few feet away, not wanting to disturb his private communion. "It would have been his 6th birthday," Jace said without turning around, his voice thick with unshed tears. He loved the spring. He would chase the new butterflies. His laughter, it was the loudest thing in this whole quiet valley. Emily's own eyes filled with tears, not for her own loss but for his. She stepped forward and without thinking placed a gentle hand on his arm. It was a simple gesture, but it was everything. It was comfort, it was understanding. It was a promise that he was no longer alone in his grief. He finally turned to look at her, his eyes raw with pain. But this time he didn't hide it. He let her see the full depth of his sorrow, and in that moment of shared vulnerability, she saw the man, not the myth. Not just the stoic rancher, not just the Native American cowboy, but Jace, a man with a heart capable of immense love and profound pain. He slowly raised his hand and brushed a stray tear from her cheek with his thumb, his touch as gentle as a feather. "Thank you, Emily," he whispered. It was the first time he had ever spoken her name. As they walked back down the hill together, a comfortable silence once again settled between them, but this time it was different. It was deeper, richer, filled not with the ghosts of the past, but with the quiet, hopeful promise of a shared future. The winter in their souls was finally, truly beginning to thaw. Spring breathed new life into the valley. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows in a riot of color, and the air was filled with the song of birds and the gentle warmth of the sun. The ranch, once a place of stark survival, was now a place of quiet, burgeoning life, both outside and within the cabin walls. The bond between Emily and Jace had deepened into a tender, unspoken affection. They worked side by side, their movements a familiar dance, their days woven together into a single, shared existence. The happiness that bloomed in Emily's heart was a fragile, precious thing. She had almost forgotten what it felt like. She found joy in the simplest of moments, the taste of fresh water from the creek, the warmth of the sun on her face, the way Jace's eyes would crinkle at the corners when he thought she wasn't looking. He was teaching her to ride, and under his patient guidance, she discovered a sense of freedom and exhilaration she had never known. Astride one of his trusted mares with Jace riding beside her, the vast Colorado landscape felt not like a threat, but like a promise. He continued to share pieces of his heritage with her, explaining how his people saw the world as a circle, with every life, every season, interconnected. It was a philosophy of balance and respect, a stark contrast to the greed and cruelty that had shattered her own world. The more she learned about his life as a Native American cowboy, the more she admired the quiet strength and dignity with which he navigated his dual identity. But the past is never truly gone. It lingers like a ghost, waiting for a moment of weakness to reappear. One afternoon, Jace returned from a rare trip into town for supplies. Emily was waiting for him, a fresh loaf of bread cooling on the table. She saw him riding up the path and her heart gave its familiar, happy leap. But as he drew closer, she saw that the calm, steady light in his eyes had been extinguished, replaced by a dark, troubled storm. His face was a grim, unreadable mask. He dismounted without a word, his movements stiff and heavy. He walked past her into the cabin, placing the sack of supplies on the table with a thud. In his other hand he held a single folded piece of paper. A letter. "This was at the post office for you," he said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. He held it out to her. Emily's blood ran cold. She stared at the letter as if it were a venomous snake. She hadn't received a letter since before her parents died. She knew, with a sickening certainty, who it was from. Her hands trembled as she took it from him. The handwriting on the front was her uncle's. She didn't want to open it. She wanted to throw it into the fire and pretend it didn't exist. To preserve the peaceful world she had built here with Jace, but she knew she couldn't. The past had found her. With a deep, steadying breath, she broke the seal. The letter was short and cruel, each word a carefully aimed dart. Her uncle Silas wrote that he had heard rumors of her shameful living arrangement with that savage. He informed her that the deed to her family's farm was now legally and irrevocably his. He finished by saying that if she ever showed her face in town again, he would have the sheriff arrest her for vagrancy. He had erased her, not just from her home, but from her very identity. The letter fell from her numb fingers. The fragile happiness she had so carefully nurtured shattered into a million pieces. All the old feelings, the grief, the helplessness, the worthlessness came rushing back, a tidal wave of despair. She sank into a chair, her face in her hands, a single, heartbroken sob escaping her lips. Jace stood by the window, his back to her, his shoulders rigid. The silence in the cabin was deafening, thick with her pain and his cold, withdrawn anger. "You should go," he said finally, his voice so low it was almost a growl. He was not looking at her. He was looking out at the valley, at the graves on the hill. His words hit her like a physical blow. "What?" she whispered, her head snapping up. "He's right," Jace continued, his voice rough with the pain she didn't understand. "This is no life for you, living out here with a man like me. The town will talk. They will ruin you. You are young. You can start over, find a good man, have a family. You don't belong in a world filled with ghosts." Every word was a nail in her coffin. He was casting her out, just like her uncle had. He was sending her back to the loneliness, back to the river. The hope that had been her anchor was being ripped away. "A man like you," she repeated, her voice rising with a mixture of disbelief and hurt. "What does that mean? A man who saved my life. A man who showed me kindness when no one else would. A man who taught me that scars don't mean you're broken." She stood up, her own anger now rising to meet his inexplicable coldness. "And what ghosts are you talking about, Jace? Mine, or yours? Are you pushing me away because of a letter from a cruel man, or because you are afraid to let anyone get close to the graves on that hill?" Her words struck a nerve. He flinched as if she had physically struck him. He turned from the window, and the anguish in his eyes was so profound it stole her breath. It wasn't anger she saw. It was fear. "I cannot lose anyone else, Emily," he said, his voice breaking. "I cannot watch the world destroy someone I care about. Again, they hate me for my blood, for the color of my skin. The town doctor let my family die. What do you think they would do to you for standing with me, for loving me?" The last two words hung in the air, an accidental, earth-shattering confession. He had said it, and in that moment, she realized he wasn't pushing her away to hurt her. He was trying to protect her, in the only way he knew how, by cutting her out of his life, by taking the pain upon himself. Tears streamed down her face, but they were no longer tears of despair. They were tears of a fierce, unshakable love. "You don't get to make that choice for me," she said, her voice trembling but strong. She walked toward him, stopping just before him, forcing him to look at her. "You think your blood makes you unworthy. Your heritage, your identity as a Native American cowboy, is the most beautiful, honorable thing about you. It's what makes you strong and kind and connected to this earth. It's what she faltered, then found her courage. "It's what I love." She reached up and cupped his face in her hands, her touch gentle but firm. "You walked into a freezing river to save me from my ghosts, Jace Walker. Do not, for 1 second, think I will let you be consumed by yours. We face them together, or not at all." His rigid composure finally broke. A single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. He leaned his forehead against hers, his eyes closing as he breathed her in. His strong arms came around her, pulling her into an embrace so tight it felt as if he was trying to merge their two souls into one. He held her, not as a savior, but as an equal, another survivor clinging to the only light he had found in the darkness. The ghosts of what was were still there, but for the first time, they were no longer standing between them. The aftermath of their confrontation left the air in the cabin thick with unspoken emotions. The walls that Jace had so carefully constructed around his heart had been breached, and the raw vulnerability that lay beneath was both terrifying and liberating. They moved through the evening chores in a state of heightened awareness, the gravity of their confession settling around them like a warm, heavy blanket. The love they felt for each other was no longer a secret, but a living, breathing entity in the small space they shared. They ate their dinner in a comfortable silence, their eyes meeting often across the small table. Each glance was filled with a universe of meaning, of questions, of hopes, of fears. After they had cleaned up, they sat by the fire, just as they had on so many nights before. But this night was different. Tonight, the future felt like a tangible thing, a path they could choose to walk together. "My father was a white trapper," Jace said softly, breaking the silence. He stared into the flames, his profile etched by the firelight. "He loved my mother, but he was a ghost in our lives, always leaving, always promising to come back. My mother's people, the Ute, they accepted me, but I never fully belonged. My skin was too light. Then I tried to live in the white man's world. There, my skin was too dark. I've spent my whole life walking a line between two worlds, with a foot in each and a home in neither." He turned to look at Emily, his eyes filled with a lifetime of quiet pain. "This ranch, this land, this is the only place I ever felt I could just be. Just Jace, not the half-breed, not the savage, just a man, a cowboy, a part of the earth. It is your home," Emily said softly, her heart aching with empathy for his profound loneliness. "It was," he corrected her gently. "It was a place to survive, a place to remember, but it wasn't a home. A home is not just a piece of land or a cabin built of logs. I learned that after I lost them." His voice caught, and he looked towards the dark window, towards the hill. "A home is a feeling. It's a person. You made this place a home again, Emily." The simple, heartfelt declaration was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. "You made me want to live again, Jace," she whispered. "You walked into that river and gave me a reason to breathe. You are my home." He reached across the small space between them and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. His hand was calloused and strong, the hand of a man who worked the land, but his touch was incredibly gentle. "I am afraid," he confessed, his voice barely audible. "I am afraid to be happy. It feels fragile, like it could be stolen away at any moment." "Then we will hold on to it together," she said, her grip on his hand tightening. "We will be stronger than the fear. Your past and my past, they don't have to be our future. We can choose to build a new life, right here. Not as two broken people trying to fix each other, but as two whole people choosing to love each other." His dark eyes searched hers, and in their depths, she saw the storm of fear finally begin to recede, replaced by a dawning light of hope. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. She met him halfway, and his lips touched hers. The kiss was not one of desperate passion, but of profound, reverent tenderness. It was a kiss of homecoming, of promises kept and futures found. It tasted of wood smoke and tears, of sorrow and of hope. In that single, gentle touch, all the pain, all the loneliness, and all the fear melted away, leaving only the pure, undeniable truth of their love. It was a love forged in the depths of despair and nurtured in the quiet solitude of the mountains. A love as strong and resilient as the ancient pines that surrounded them. They didn't need grand declarations or sweeping promises. They had found what they needed in each other's arms, in the silent understanding that passed between them. They would face the world together. The town, with its prejudice, and her uncle, with his hatred, no longer seemed like insurmountable obstacles. They were just distant shadows, powerless against the bright, shining love that filled the small cabin. The next morning, Emily awoke in the bed, and Jace was beside her, fully clothed, having slept on top of the blankets, a silent guardian through the night. He was already awake, watching her, a small, genuine smile finally reaching his eyes. It transformed his face, chasing away the last vestiges of sorrow and revealing the handsome, gentle man beneath. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice soft in the early morning light. "Good morning," she replied, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. Later that day, they rode out together, not to work, but simply to be. They climbed to the top of a ridge that overlooked the entire valley, the ranch a tiny speck below. The sun was warm on their faces, and a gentle breeze whispered through the pines. They sat on a sun-warmed rock, their shoulders touching, looking out at the vast, beautiful world. "My mother used to say that every sunrise is a promise," Jace said, his arm wrapping around her, pulling her close. "A promise of a new beginning. A chance to leave the darkness behind." Emily leaned her head on his shoulder, her heart filled with a profound sense of peace. The river of her sorrows felt like a distant memory from another lifetime. Her uncle's cruel letter was just a piece of paper, its power gone. All that mattered was the man beside her and the future that stretched out before them, as wide and as promising as the Colorado sky. Jace, the quiet, solitary Native American cowboy, had found his place not between two worlds, but in a new world they would build together. And Emily, the girl who had lost everything, had found that sometimes a stranger can become your miracle, and a place of survival can become the one place you were always meant to call home. They watched the sun climb higher in the sky, two souls no longer defined by the scars they carried, but by the love that had healed them. It was not just a happy ending, it was a beautiful beginning.